Today I'm with Dominic, the Head of Research at Binari Property. And Dominic, we're talking about the Perth property market, what it's looking like for investors for 2026.
Yep.
And we've certainly seen the last couple of years, I think Perth had last year the biggest price growth, 60% overall in the Perth market, and it was the biggest of any capital city in Australia. Even this last quarter, coming up to September this year, it's had an increase of about 4%, which once again's the biggest in the country just this last quarter. So can you just give a bit of a recap on where it's performed this year and how you see it moving into 2026?
Yeah, it's the last few years, Perth's been extremely strong, including the last year. And as you say, the last quarter still pretty positive. I mean, the Perth market was stagnant for a fair while there and seems to often perform similarly to Brisbane. So when Brisbane does well or when Perth does well, they both tend to do quite well. And it's kind of been the same over the last 5 or 6 years. Those two have sort of been some of the standouts in around the country in terms of capital growth and so forth. Like anything, there's various markets within a capital city, and you've got to be conscious of the fact that not everywhere in Perth will perform the same. And the other thing you've got to be careful of is when you're in these markets as an investor, when a market is performing the way Perth is, it can sometimes mask the fundamental issues that might exist in certain areas within Perth. You know, people buying house and land packages on the outskirts of the city in areas where there's no real scarcity. There's a lot of supply, and the demand is predominantly driven by investors. When the Perth market inevitably goes through a bit of a correction and a more subdued period, those are the areas that will typically perform not so great. Right. So you've just got to be really conscious. But the market has been very strong, low vacancies, strong price growth. It's been very positive.
Yeah, I was reading the other day that the time on market at the moment is 12 days for a listing, which is crazy.
Crazy, yeah.
And then the listings is down about 45% on what it was 5 years ago. So once again, like we've spoken time and time again, there's this supply issue that's impacting every market in Australia, including the Perth market.
Yeah. I think broadly speaking, we've got an undersupply of new dwellings. It's the same in Perth. It's the same as it is on the East Coast. Probably the one thing where Perth is a little bit different to the East Coast markets is that it's kind of a bit more isolated over there. And, you know, a lot of our migration, or 80% of our overseas migration, lands on the East Coast. So it's not necessarily getting as much as what we're getting on the East Coast, but still getting a reasonable proportion of that. And you know, in recent years, they've had higher levels of interstate migration than what they've traditionally had, which is then adding more and more, putting more pressure on the property market over there. Right. But, you know, there are parts of Perth that are really limited in terms of their supply, but there are other parts of Perth where, you know, geographic constraints don't exist, and therefore there's the ability to continue building. And probably the biggest concern I have is around the Perth market is it is still very reliant on the mining sector. Right. And if the mining sector were to, you know, and I speak to a lot of people based in Perth quite regularly, and they sort of echo the same sentiment that things are very, very strong at the moment. But for those who are a little bit older and remember what things were like, you know, 10, 15, sort of 20 years ago, it doesn't always, it's maybe not as consistent as, say, the cities on the East Coast, but it's been extremely strong. If you're buying in the right areas, I think you'll be fine in Perth. If you're buying in the areas that are driven by investors and on the outskirts of the city, maybe the areas that Perth locals aren't typically purchasing in, that could potentially pose some risks down the line.
Well, it's certainly got a strong labour market there at the moment. There's a lot of confidence in the Perth market, and certainly what we're seeing is the type of developments they're building now are quite more high end than probably what they were about 20 years ago. So there's certainly the prices they're looking at for some of the apartments there in those inner city areas or within 5 or 10 minutes drive of the city are decent prices they're asking. So I think in those areas, it seems to be a fairly strong market.
Quite strong, yeah. I think like any market, to be honest, if you've got a high proportion of owner-occupiers, you're typically held in pretty good stead. Yep. There's no doubt there's some really good developers over in Perth that are doing some really good quality projects that would predominantly market them to owner-occupiers and sell those. And then, you know, like any city, there are the other developers who are out there doing some things that aren't so great and are being sold a lot to investors where there's not that much accountability there because most of the investors are Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane based who are never actually going to go over and venture over there. So,
and of course, a house and land package for $500,000-$600,000 sounds like a bargain when you compare it to Sydney, right?
Exactly. So I think what's been unique about Perth is that having those price points, whilst being on average quite similar to Brisbane in terms of overall average pricing, in Brisbane you just don't have that ability to be buying for sort of 500-600. So it's made Perth a bit more attractive. And when a lot of those properties are on the coastline, it seems quite lucrative when you consider what coastal properties are worth on the East Coast. The difference probably just being that there's less scarcity of coastline over there. So it's a market that's done really well. I actually think moving forward into 2026, it probably continues to do quite well. But yeah, the only thing would be to exercise caution when you go into the Perth market and make sure you're buying in areas where you are surrounded by owner-occupiers, because right now everything's doing well, but it's not always the case. Yeah.
Well, I think the Perth market, unlike other markets, you don't get the high-rise 30-story apartment blocks over there. They're more boutique.
Yeah.
3 or 4 or 5 stories, which has a great owner-occupier appeal to them.
Yeah.
Infrastructure, but also the restaurants and entertainment and things like that is certainly improving to what it was.
They seem to be getting more and more of the good sporting events and things like that as well, which is obviously good for the city. So I think off the back of it, and similar to Brisbane and the Gold Coast no longer being the country town equivalents of sort of Sydney and Melbourne, I think they'll all improve. I think that the broad view of property in Australia looks pretty positive, moving forward. So, and I think Perth will be no different, so it's still pretty strong. It'll just be about making sure that you make good decisions. And for a lot of investors, buying in Perth can be a bit daunting because it does feel so far away, but the market's done really, really well. And I think there are opportunities that exist over in Perth. There are opportunities that exist on the East Coast, but the market itself looks pretty solid.
Well, Dominic, thanks for your insights into the Perth property market for 2026.
Thanks, Grant.